We're now in the general business, and Sam will present.
So the next item is in reference to the FY24 financial audit results. I knew that Mr. Cullinan, who you just saw on the screen, actually standing there, is going to speak to us in just a moment. But I wanted to highlight for the public, you're seeing on the screen a memo that I requested from our Director of Finance to speak to the results of the audit, meaning the surplus, and add context to the source of the surplus. So he's going to walk us through this particular memo. So counselors have received a copy in person, but also we have it displayed here on the screen for those to watch and look at. All right, Mr. Cullen, you can take it.
Thank you, Sam. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. I'm Chris Cullinan, the city's Director of Finance. This item is actually a report. There's no action to be taken at this point. And in some ways, this is a continuation of the report that we made at your last meeting in December, where the city's auditors gave a verbal confirmation of an unmodified or clean opinion regarding the accounting and reporting of the city's finances for the fiscal year 2024. They have since issued written confirmation of this opinion, and we've completed all the required disclosures to various regulatory agencies and have published the annual comprehensive financial report. It's available on the Finance Department's webpage, and hard copies are available upon request. We've also submitted it to the Government Finance Officers Association for their annual Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting program. And so the fiscal year 24, the general fund ended with approximately $22.4 million in excess of the 17% fund balance policy. This represents approximately 9.8% of the adopted FY 2024 budget. And so the memo that you have in front of you is a little deeper dive that Mr. Sanders requested in looking at sort of what makes that up, driving a little bit more to the why and some of the reasons for the results that we see. And in some ways, it's similar to what we've seen in the past. Generally speaking, revenues performed better than expected. Expenditures were less than budgeted. On the revenue side of things, general fund revenues were approximately $12.5 million over budget. The big drivers for this number you see here are sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of the usual suspects that we see in given years. Obviously, the real estate tax revenue is the largest source of the city's overall revenues for the general fund budget. We continue to see a very robust real estate market. And so those revenues came in a little bit higher than expected. Interest income, this is continuation from last year to the extent that the city has benefited from higher interest rates. When the city treasurer invests our idle cash, it generates interest income. And so with those higher interest rates, we've received more than we expect. And this is a good example, I think, of what, when we talk about one-time, we treat surpluses as one-time events. This is actually a pretty good example of this. Obviously, interest rates beyond our control, very unpredictable. We would not want to build a budget around rosy interest rate projections. That could certainly lead to longer term issues. And so, so this is an example of when interest rates are higher than expected and it generates additional revenue, we see that come here. Again, personal property tax, business and professional licenses, meals tax, sales tax. Again, these are all indicators of a robust local economy. These are all locally sourced, locally generated revenues. And again, these are the big ones which drive that bigger $12.5 million figure in terms of the revenues. Remy, if you want to slide down to the next page there. Thank you. And so, as I mentioned, expenses were less than budgeted to the tune of about $9.2 million under budget. And much of this was a result of savings in salaries and benefits being under budget. Some of this is the result of, as the organization continues to make efforts to attract additional workers to fill vacancies and retain those workers. Those efforts are still underway. One point that I would make in looking at these numbers is keep in mind this budget began in July of 2023. So we're almost looking back 18 months plus as to when these numbers started to become reality. That was before Mr. Sanders was even city manager. That was when Mr. Rogers was still here. And so to the extent that some of the changes that Mr. Sanders has made in the organization, some of the reorganization, some of the things, that you've heard about already this evening, those were not fully realized in that fiscal year. Those are things that were still evolving through FY24 and have continued into the current fiscal year. And so, so salaries and benefits is the largest sort of single thing that we can point to in terms of line items that were under budget. But then there's a secondary effect. If positions aren't filled, some of the other consumables that person would have used in their job are also not spent for. So there's also a sort of a secondary effect in terms of some of the non-personnel line items that were under budget. And you see below some of the larger departments that were under budget. Again, most of these, but not all, were the results of savings from salary and benefit savings. And again, it's the larger departments, as one might expect to see, that were driving some of that. One of the other things that has also been sort of unique to the last few years, this is point number 3 on this memo. For lack of a better term, I think we've seen some recycling of past budgets. And what I mean by that is, as it's been discussed this evening, the policy is to set these funds aside, one-time monies for one-time uses. Our financial management policy states that should go to the CIP contingency. However, there are years when there are other investments, other needs on a more operating level that are one-time in nature, but are germane to a specific department. And so what we've seen a little bit, we saw this last year. This year, for me, when I was actually going back to the numbers, it jumped out to me a little bit more. You see down below here some of the decisions that were made a year ago regarding the FY23 surplus. We put some of those monies into department budgets for specific things. And you see some of these examples here. And just to be very, very clear, this is not in any way, shape, or form a criticism or anything of these specific things. These are clearly things that these departments have been doing, clearly things that were needed. But what we've discovered is when we add these monies back into departments, these departments already came in under budget already. And so again, it's hard to know, halfway through the fiscal year where you're going to end up in a particular budget. But these departments ended up under budget as these funds just sort of added to that. So again, sort of, as I said, sort of a recycling of some past surpluses that we see here. And then point number 4 here, just to maybe zoom out a little bit and look at, kind of what our experience has been for the past few years. As you look at, for the past, 6 fiscal years back to 2019, you can see there's been something of a change. Something's changed in, these results. But if we think about the last 6 years, at the risk of making the understatement of the year as early as January 21st, a lot's happened, both in the world, both in our community, in our organization. There are still some things that, we're still trying to get our heads around in terms of what the changes that maybe COVID made in terms of some of our revenues. We're still trying to figure some of those things out because, again, we do budget conservatively. We have a history of that. We take a very pragmatic view of things, and we want to see some trends before we start making some significant changes into the kind of projections that we made on the revenue side, and then expenditures as well. Again, over the last number of years, there's been some significant changes all throughout the organization, from the city manager all the way down on the lead team. And so those obviously affect continuity, initiating things, getting programs done, keeping them going, those sorts of things. So so when when I put my analyst hat on and I try to look at these last few years, it's difficult to figure, it's difficult to point to one specific thing or a handful of things. There are trends that we see, but it is difficult to suss out some of the specifics because, again, there's been so much change both at a global level but also at a very micro level too in terms of the city organization. And so be happy to answer any questions you might have about some of these items. Looking ahead, as I mentioned, this is just a report, and your next meeting in February will actually be the year-end appropriation, which will include this item as well as a few other housekeeping items that we do at the end of every fiscal year to close the books. We'll also have a public hearing as well, just based on the amount of money. And Mr. Sanders has already tipped his cards, and that the recommendation is going to be that we follow the city's financial management policy and that the surplus go to the CIP contingency. And certainly tonight, for the last hour and a half, you've certainly had a very robust discussion about the city's capital needs in the next few years. And so that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any question, Louis?
Yeah, Mr. Cullen, the question that I've got is, and it may be something that is not capable of being readily answered right now, but maybe need to think a little bit about. Clearly, I should preface the question with another question. That's, to what extent was let's say the $22 million or the $21 million surplus in 22 and in 23, to what extent were those surpluses a function of having been too conservative on budgeting for the revenues?
So in 22, it definitely was. That's the COVID rebound year, and so that's coming out of that budget. Again, keeping just the timing of these things in mind. For example, we're considering right now the FY26 budget, but the final results of that won't be known for another 18 months. And so obviously, and we think back to times of COVID, it was very difficult to sometimes see sort of a week or two ahead at times. And so
Right.
when the FY22 budget was built, I can say with certainty that we definitely were on the more conservative side as it came to revenues, and then saw as vaccines rolled out, pandemic closures ended, we saw that rebound. And so in that year, I can say for sure. The last 2 years, 23 and 24, we have seen, similar strong performance on the revenue side. I would argue that the revenues are actually, we're getting better at that and getting those numbers to what I would say, if you were to ask, my professional opinion about how close should you be to budget, I think for a budget of our size and complexity, 5% is a reasonable number. But as you can see, we're at 9.8 in FY24, 10.2, 11.9. And again, if you look further back into 2019, 2020, you see those numbers more kind of along the lines that I just described. And so I think on the revenue side, we're getting a better understanding of that. It's the expense side that I think still is a bit of a conundrum as to the issue of hiring, retaining, keeping people, those sorts of things. But again, as I mentioned, these results go back to the time before Mr. Sanders was city manager, has put his management team in place and gone about stabilizing the organization. So I think, that given time, we'll see those percentages get back down to more of, like I said, what we've seen traditionally in the past.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking is the real estate tax revenue. I don't have all of the numbers from our debate from last year in mind, but the real estate tax revenue being $3.5 million more than what was budgeted feels to me like it's essentially what we get in any year when there has been, say, a 6% or a 7% growth in the real estate tax base, simply because our second half payment, the second half of our fiscal year is going to be based, that payment in June is going to be based upon the reassessment that will have taken place in January. And so having that $3 million there is not terribly surprising, and it would probably be poor fiscal management to assume that we're always going to have a 7% or more growth in real estate rates.
I agree with all the things that you just said. Again, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe we collect about $90 million a year. So you're talking $3 million on a $90 million number. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that we have a very dynamic real estate market. And so to keep those, the market tends to outstrip the assessments by some margin. We obviously try to keep those as close as possible as we're required to, but there is a little bit of a lag. And so, and then new construction and some of those things, we do find ourselves usually having a little bit better results on the real estate side than we usually do. But you also hit on one thing as well. I didn't know how deep we wanted to go on this conversation, but one of the other things that, a challenge that we have from Ms. Hamill and for the budget team is that for some of these revenues, they don't fit neatly with the budget calendar. We usually at least have a 2-month lag in terms of reporting from the state on things like meals tax, sales tax, some of those sorts of things. We're getting ready to get the new assessment number in the next week or so. I believe it's business and professional license, that information that Mr. Divers gets, I think usually comes in March. And so, again, the timing of some of these things don't match up neatly with the planning for the budget. And then by the time Mr. Sanders needs to present to you and we need to go through the adoption process. So that's always been a challenge. But again, with some of these other sort of dynamic things in place, it can make that a little more challenging.
Well, I guess what I'm really trying to get at is, as we're looking at the numbers of $11 million over general fund revenues from the 6 taxes, the sales tax number less than $1 million over seems to me to be within anybody's tolerances at that point. And that's actually fairly close. The other numbers, I don't know what the amount is that they would be up. Personal property tax, though, would seem to have been up rather substantially. B-poll taxes up substantially, and you say that's mainly a function of the healthy economy. The issue that I'm thinking about right now is what percentage increases do you believe is going to be appropriate to assume when constructing your revenue estimates for this coming year? Are we going to assume a 1%, 2% kind of pro forma increase, which would seem to me to be probably pretty safe? But on the other hand, I mean, you certainly don't want to say, oh, of course we're going to have another 5 or 6 or 8% growth rate this year. Any sense now of what that expected growth rate ought to look like, or is that something that come March we will be able to learn from you all that this was the figure that you landed on?
I would say probably the latter, because that is something we're working on almost on a weekly basis right now. Because again, the timing of some of these key things, and Mr. Sanders and Ms. Hamill are burning the midnight oil to balance the budget. And so again, you probably heard us talk about this in the past. We have a revenue team comprised of all the money related folks around the city, and we look at a number of things. We look at actual performance, so we certainly take these numbers into account. We also look at current year, where we think we ought to be as well, to the extent that we might only be 5 or 6 months into the current fiscal year, but are we seeing trends or seeing anything that also informs the projection for next year as well? So, and we're doing those numbers up until pretty much the last minute to get a number for Mr. Sanders to build his budget around.
Yeah. Well, my just overall thought is we want to be conservative in the sense of not making ridiculous assumptions, but I think we also can afford to be somewhat realistic in assuming a certain amount of growth in these numbers year over year. I know there have occasionally been years, but only very occasionally been years where there has not been that kind of increase in growth. And so for the benefit of the schools, if nothing else, to assure them that we're not sort of intentionally deflating these numbers to avoid giving them more money, I hope that we can work on trying to be as realistic as is prudent.
And prudency, I think, is the word. And again, COVID obviously impacted so many of what our expectations or norms used to be in a whole host of things. But on the financial side of things as well, again, we had a big rebound year sort of right after COVID. And, we've been trying to assess, how much of that is one time, or is it one time, but does it have some legs and then it might run over a couple of fiscal years? Or are we getting back to sort of a new normal? Does it look anything like it has in the past? And I think we're still struggling with that a little bit. Obviously we still have, as I mentioned before, high interest rates. Inflation, while it's been cooling, still is relatively high compared to historic trends. The cost of automobiles, which obviously impacts our personal property taxes. You'll recall at the height of the pandemic, used car prices, for example, were almost as high as new car prices. And new car prices were high as well, just given the impacts on supply chains. And so, again, we've seen those numbers cooling over the last few years, but again, they're still higher than what we've seen in the past. So, again, it's that balancing act of trying to have sort of a healthy skepticism, but also at the same time, again, is to use your word, be prudent in terms of what a reasonable projection might be.
I would just second that obviously it's good to have a big surplus, but it's concerning just in the sense that it's not conservative. It just doesn't reflect reality and kind of what's going on to create that situation, which is other touched on, just creates a challenge, because then when we're making decisions about tax rates or investments in the CIP or investments in schools, we're making decisions in just an incorrect information environment. And obviously that has, a meaningful policy impact, which is beyond the surplus. I think, it taps into a concern I have as well that, in that long, debt table of our affordability, it's making assumptions that don't track historical growth rates. Forget COVID, like 2019 through pre-2008. So how accurate is that? Conservative, or is it just not reflecting what our real growth rates are? All that aside, I would say the other thing is seeing that a portion of it is underspending from surpluses going to departments that anticipated not having enough money. To me is a red flag that something about how we're doing those department budgets just isn't accurate enough. So yeah.
So this is helpful for me because I know this information, because I know just out in the public, we'll get asked about the increase. So this is, the surplus. So this will be helpful, and along with the explanation. And I think that without explanation and the community trust of us, I think that will go a long way in what we're trying to do and accomplish. So, any other questions?
Did you say this would end up on your
Yes.
transparency portal page, or
It will be there. Yep.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.